She called it debris in the divorce. I sold it for millions. I spent 15 years learning to taste the difference between heaven and almost heaven, and I never saw the knife coming until it was already buried in my back. My name's Thomas, and I'm what they call a master distiller. Or I was, anyway, third generation in the bourbon business, running the same distillery my grandfather built back in 1947. Not the fancy kind you see on Instagram with copper stills polished like mirrors and tour groups taking selfies. Ours was the real deal. The kind where you knew every barrel by the char level, every mash bill by the way it smelled on day 3 of fermentation. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, drive through the Kentucky fog to the distillery lab, and start my day the same way I had for the past decade. Nosing samples, tasting, making notes in my leather journal that was so beaten up the pages were coming loose. People think it's glamorous being a distiller. They imagine us swirling glasses and talking about hints of vanilla and caramel like wine snobs. But the truth is, it's chemistry and patience and love. Mostly love. The lab was my sanctuary. Small room, concrete floor, one window that faced east so I could catch the sunrise. I had 12 sample glasses set up every morning, and I'd taste them blind. No labels, just numbers written on tape. I needed to know our product. So well I could identify which barrel the whiskey came from just by taste. Barrel 247 had a slight oakiness from being stored in the back corner where the temperature swung more. Barrel 189 was sweeter because we'd use a higher corn ratio that year. These weren't just barrels. They were living things, and I knew every single one of them. The smell in that lab was what home should smell like. Yeast and grain and the ghost of evaporated alcohol hanging in the air. Wood and time and chemistry doing their slow dance. Some mornings I'd just stand there breathing it in before I started work, thinking about how my grandfather had stood in this same spot, doing the same thing. How my dad had. How maybe someday my kid would, if Linda and I ever got around to having one. Linda. I should have seen it coming with Linda, but when you're nose deep in your work, you miss the signs. Or maybe you see them, and you tell yourself you're being paranoid. That's what I did. Anyway, it started small. She stopped asking about my day. Used to be, I'd come home smelling like a distillery, and she'd wrinkle her nose and laugh, and ask me what I was working on. Then one day she just stopped. Started heading straight for the shower when I tried to hug her, claiming she'd just gotten out and didn't want to get sweaty again. Funny how she was always freshly showered right when I got home. Then came the phone thing. She'd got a new phone, she said. Needed better security because of some credit card fraud scare. Set up a password. Started keeping it face down on the table. Would check it at 2 in the morning, and I'd hear that soft ping in the darkness and pretend I was still asleep. The blue light would glow on her face for 10, 15 minutes while she typed away. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say it was her sister. Her sister, who apparently had insomnia and a lot to say at 2 in the morning. The money thing was harder to ignore. Linda had always been careful with spending. Practical. Then suddenly there were charges for $5,000 to some medical spa in Louisville. When I asked about it, she said it was a new skincare treatment, a preventative thing. All her friends were doing it. I didn't know anything about skincare, so I let it go. Then there was another charge, and another $15,000 in 3 months on preventative skincare. But when I brought it up gently, because I didn't want to start a fight, she turned around on me, said I was one to talk about medical expenses, that my back surgery last year cost more than her car, that my physical therapy bills were draining our savings account, that I was being selfish worrying about her taking care of herself when I'd spent 20 grand on my spine. She wasn't wrong about the surgery cost. Insurance covered most of it, but not all. And yeah, the physical therapy added up, but I needed that surgery to keep working, to keep doing the job that paid for everything. The mental gymnastics we do to avoid seeing what's right in front of us could win Olympic gold. Meanwhile, my brother Richard was circling. Richard was the business side of our operation. I made the whiskey, he sold it. That was a deal when Dad died and left us the company as equal partners. Richard wore suits that cost more than my truck payment, and had his hair styled in a way that probably required product with names I couldn't pronounce. He drove a BMW, had an office with leather furniture, and one of those abstract paintings that cost 20 grand and looked like someone spilled paint on accident. My office was next to the barrel warehouse and smelled like oak and char. I wore the same work jacket I'd had for 8 years. I drove a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles on it that ran like a dream because I actually maintained it. We were brothers, but we might as well have been from different planets. Richard started coming to me more often with paperwork. Emergency paperwork. The distillery business has regulations coming out of every angle. TTB, state liquor boards, FDA, OSHA. You name it, someone's regulating it. So when Richard showed up with a stack of documents 3 inches thick and said we had a surprise IRS audit and needed signatures by end of business or they'd shut us down, I believed him. I was in the lab testing a new barrel finish technique, had 6 different samples going, and was right in the middle of logging results. My lower back was screaming at me, a souvenir from last month when I'd insisted on moving a row of vintage barrels by hand, because I didn't trust a forklift operator with the older stock. I was 2 painkillers deep and counting the minutes until I could go home and put ice on it. That's when Richard burst in, frantic, sweating, saying the auditors were already here, that they'd found some discrepancy in our tax filings from 3 years ago. That was probably just a clerical error, but we needed to sign amended forms immediately or they'd freeze our accounts and padlock the doors. He had this whole speech prepared, talked about our employees, 23 people who depended on us for their paychecks, talked about the legacy, about what Dad would have wanted, about how this was just bureaucratic nonsense, but we had to play their game. He put the papers in front of me, showed me where to initial, where to sign. Over 100 pages. Said his lawyer had already reviewed everything, and it was just formalities. I signed. Of course I signed. I was exhausted from pulling a 60-hour week trying to perfect a new recipe. I trusted my brother, and I was terrified of being the reason 23 families lost their income over some paperwork error. That was 4 days before the board meeting. The board meeting was supposed to be about expansion. We've been talking for months about adding a second still, maybe opening a tasting room. Our bourbon was winning awards. Small batch, handcrafted. The kind of stuff that whiskey nerds went crazy for. We had distribution deals pending. Everything was pointing up. I walked into the conference room in my work clothes. Jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that had mash stuck in the treads. Richard was there in another $1,000 suit, navy blue this time. And there were 3 people I didn't recognize. 2 men and a woman, all dressed like lawyers or bankers or whatever species of person wears charcoal gray and carries leather portfolios. Richard introduced them. Representatives from Bev Corp. I'd heard of Bev Corp. They were one of those massive conglomerates that owned 50 different alcohol brands. The kind of company that turned craft distilleries into production lines and fired everyone who cared about quality. The kind of company we'd always sworn we'd never sell to. I felt my stomach drop before anyone said a word. It was the way Richard was sitting. Too casual. Too comfortable. The way the BevCorp people were looking at me with this mixture of pity and calculation. The way nobody was making eye contact. The lead guy from BevCorp started talking. Said they were excited to welcome our brand into their portfolio. Started throwing around numbers and synergies and market penetration statistics. I cut him off. Asked what the hell he was talking about. Said we weren't selling. That's when Richard dropped it. Smiled his tight, satisfied smile, and said we'd already sold. That the deal closed yesterday. That I'd signed the paperwork myself. I actually laughed. It was such an absurd thing to say. I'd never signed any sale documents. I'd have remembered selling my family's legacy. I'd have fought it. Then Richard slid a folder across the table, opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab, and there was my signature, right there on a document titled Agreement of Sale and Transfer of Assets. It was buried in the IRS audit paperwork. Page 73 of 108, nestled between a depreciation schedule and an equipment inventory form. My signature, clear as day, agreeing to sell the distillery to Bev Corp for a sum that Richard and BevCorp had negotiated without me. I lost it. I'm not proud of it, but I completely lost it. Started yelling about fraud and betrayal, and how you can't just trick someone into signing away their life's work. Richard just sat there with his arms crossed, waiting for me to finish. When I finally ran out of breath, he said the lawyers had reviewed everything and it was completely legal. I'd signed as a co-owner with full authority. The sale was final. That's when Linda walked in. I hadn't even known she was in the building. She was supposed to be at work. She was a real estate agent, had her own office across town. But there she was, walking into the conference room like she'd been invited, like she belonged there. She sat down next to Richard. Not next to me, next to Richard. I looked at her, waiting for her to say something, to back me up, to tell them this was insane. She met my eyes and I saw something I'd never seen before. Nothing. Just flat, calculated nothing. She said I was living in the past, that we needed money, not principles, that she was tired of waiting for my barrels to age while we drove old trucks, and lived in a house that needed updating. 2 days later, she filed for divorce. The divorce papers were delivered to me at the distillery. By then, BevCorp had already changed the locks. I wasn't allowed in the building without an escort. My lab was being cleared out by strangers in corporate polo shirts who didn't know the difference between a hydrometer and a thermometer. The divorce filing was brutal. Clinical. Linda wanted the house, the cars, the investment accounts, the furniture, everything we'd built together. I could have the hunting cabin my grandfather had left me in the mountains, the old place nobody had used in 20 years. She even had specific language in there about it. The husband shall receive the deteriorated cabin structure and all debris, junk, and contents located therein. Debris, junk, contents. That's how she described my inheritance from my grandfather. That's how little she thought of anything that mattered to me. The board meeting ended with security escorting me out. Actual security guards. One on each side like I was some kind of threat. They walked me to my truck, watched me get in, waited until I drove off the property. Took my company phone. Took my key card. Took my grandfather's name off the building before I even made it to the highway. I drove around for 3 hours. Didn't know where to go. Couldn't go home because it wasn't my home anymore. Linda had the locks changed. Found that out when I tried to get some clothes and my key wouldn't work. She texted me that I could collect my personal items during supervised visits arranged through her lawyer. So I drove through the back roads of Kentucky, past farms and forests and little towns that still had hardware stores on Main Street. I watched the sun set over fields of corn stubble and tried to understand how my entire life had collapsed in 48 hours. The smell of my truck was the only familiar thing left. Old coffee in the cup holder, motor oil and work boots, and the faint ghost of bourbon that had soaked into the seats from my clothes over the years. I pulled over a rest stop and just sat there in the dark, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. My phone rang. It was Richard. I almost didn't answer, but some stupid part of me thought maybe he was calling to apologize, to say it was all a mistake. He wanted to talk logistics. Wanted to know when I'd be clearing out my personal items from the lab. Said BevCorp was sending their own master distiller, and they needed the space. Told me not to worry, that my severance package was generous, that I should be grateful they'd structured the deal to give me a payout. I asked him why. Why would he destroy something our grandfather built? Something Dad spent his whole life growing. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said the business was dying, that craft bourbon was a fad, that the market was saturated, that in 5 years we'd be bankrupt anyway, that he'd saved us, that he'd gotten us out at the peak. He was lying, of course. Our sales were up 30% year over year. We had a waiting list for our special releases. But Richard had never understood the actual business. He understood spreadsheets and profit margins, but he didn't understand that you can't put a price on legacy, on doing something right even when it's hard, on the feel of a perfectly balanced mash bill, or the way a 15-year barrel smells when you crack it open for the first time. I hung up on him, sat there in my truck at the rest stop, and watched 18-wheelers roll past on the interstate, each one going somewhere. All I had was my truck, whatever clothes Linda decided to let me have, and a half-collapsed cabin in the mountains that I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The divorce moved fast. Linda had already lined up a shark of a lawyer, some guy from Louisville who specialized in high-asset divorces. I got a public defender type who handled divorce cases on the side and seemed permanently exhausted. Linda's lawyer buried us in motions and depositions and discovery requests. Every piece of paper cost money I didn't have. Bev Corp had structured the sale so that my payout was tied up in company stock that couldn't be liquidated for 18 months. Very legal, very clever. Richard got cash. I got paper. And my bank accounts were frozen pending the divorce settlement, so I couldn't even access the money I'd saved over the years. I was effectively broke. Not poor broke. Broke. The kind where you count change to buy gas station coffee. I tried to fight the divorce terms. Tried to argue that I should get half the house, half the investments. My lawyer filed the motions. Linda's lawyer crushed them. Pointed out that I'd signed away the business for a stock payout I couldn't access. Claimed I'd hidden assets. Painted me as financially irresponsible. The judge looked at me like I was wasting the court's time. The final settlement gave Linda everything. The house, both cars, the investment accounts, even the dog, Barley, golden retriever I'd raised from a puppy. Linda argued she was better positioned to care for him because I didn't have stable housing. The judge agreed. The worst part wasn't losing the house. It was the day I had to watch Linda load Barley into her SUV during the final property division. He knew something was wrong. Dogs always know. He was whining, pulling against the leash, trying to get back to me. His tail was tucked between his legs, and he kept looking back over his shoulder with those brown eyes that trusted me to fix whatever was happening. Linda didn't even want him. I knew she didn't. She complained for years about the dog hair on the furniture, about having to let him out in the mornings. But she knew taking him would hurt me worse than anything else. So she yanked his collar and shoved him into the back seat and drove away while he pressed his face against the window. That's when I knew there was no love left. Maybe there never had been. You don't weaponize a dog against someone you ever cared about. I got the cabin, the debris, the junk, the contents. I signed the papers in a conference room that smelled like recycled air and printer toner. Linda wouldn't look at me, just sat there checking her phone while the lawyers shuffled documents. When it was done, her lawyer handed me a key to the cabin. Single key on a ring with a paper tag. No address, just coordinates. Like they'd forgotten the place even had a road leading to it. I walked out of that building with nothing but my truck, a duffel bag of clothes I collected from the house during a supervised visit, and a key to a place I barely remembered. Rock bottom, they call it. But the thing about rock bottom is you don't know you're there until you start digging and realize there's still more bottom underneath. The cabin was 3 hours away, up in the mountains where my grandfather used to hunt deer. I'd been there maybe twice as a kid. Remembered it being small, but solid, a place to get away from the world. I should have known better than to trust my childhood memories. I loaded up the truck with what little I had left and started driving. Left the city behind, left the distillery and the house and the life I'd built. Drove through small towns and smaller towns, and then just forest. The roads got narrower, the pavement got worse, and eventually I was on a dirt track that barely qualified as a road. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a horror movie. Sagging roof, broken windows, porch that looked like it would collapse if you breathed on it too hard. The whole structure was leaning slightly to the left, like it was tired and wanted to lie down. I sat in the truck for a long time, just staring at it. This was what my life had become. This was what I got for 15 years of expertise and loyalty and try to do things right. Debris, junk, contents. I got out of the truck and walked up to what used to be a porch. The wood groaned under my weight. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, and the smell that hit me was decay and mouse droppings and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. Inside was worse. Holes in the ceiling where rain had gotten through. Water stains on every wall. Furniture that had rotted into unrecognizable lumps. The floor was buckled and soft in places, like the foundation had given up years ago. I stood in the middle of what used to be a living room and felt something break inside me. Not snap, break. Like a piece of glass that goes from whole to powder with no in-between. I'd lost everything. My business, my wife, my home, my dog. And I was standing in a collapsing shack in the middle of nowhere with no plan and no hope and no idea what to do next. This was where it ended. Or at least, this was where I thought it ended. I didn't know yet about what was hiding under my feet. Didn't know that sometimes rock bottom has a false floor, and underneath there's either hell or treasure. Turned out it was both. I stood there in that rotting cabin, staring at the water-stained walls and collapsed furniture, and I realized I hadn't eaten in about 14 hours. The last meal had been a gas station sandwich, somewhere around an hour or two of the drive up here. My stomach was making sounds like a garbage disposal, trying to eat a spoon. I pulled out my wallet. Credit card, debit card, $63 in cash. I'd stop somewhere on the way back down the mountain tomorrow, get some groceries, figure out what came next. Except there was no tomorrow trip down the mountain. I found that out at the gas station in the little town I'd driven through on the way up, place called Harlan's Creek. Population, maybe 800 if you counted the dogs. One main street with a hardware store, a diner, and this gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. I filled up the truck. $38. Went inside to grab some instant coffee and a box of Pop-Tarts. Basic survival supplies. The total came to $46 and change. I handed the clerk my debit card. Declined. I tried again. Same result. The card reader just kept flashing that soul-crushing word. Declined. 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 The clerk looked at me with that mixture of pity and suspicion you get when your card doesn't work. Like, maybe I was trying to pull something. I told her to try my credit card instead. She ran it. Declined. I paid with the cash and walked out to the truck with my hands shaking. Sat in the driver's seat and called the bank's 1-800 number. Waited through 7 minutes of hold music. Finally got a human being. The account was frozen. Both accounts. Checking and savings. Frozen pending resolution of a divorce settlement. The rep couldn't tell me when they'd be unfrozen. Couldn't tell me anything except that I'd need to contact my attorney. I hung up and just sat there with the phone in my hand. I had $247,000 in those accounts. $247,000 I'd saved over 15 years of 12-hour days and careful living. Money I couldn't touch. Money that might as well have been on Mars. The $17 left in my wallet was all I had in the world. $17 in a truck with half a tank of gas and a cabin that was actively trying to kill me through structural failure. This wasn't poverty. This was something worse. This was being rich and broke at the same time. Having everything on paper and nothing in reality. It was humiliation served cold with a side of legal paperwork. Linda had planned this. She'd timed the account freeze perfectly. Right after she got her separation. Right before the actual divorce hearing. Left me just enough rope to hang myself with. I'd paid my worthless lawyer $5,000 in cash 2 days before the accounts froze. $5,000 that bought me exactly nothing except a front row seat to losing everything. I drove back up the mountain with my Pop-Tarts and instant coffee and tried to figure out what came next. The distillery sale wouldn't finalize for another 6 weeks. My payout was tied up in company stock that I couldn't liquidate for 18 months per the purchase agreement. Very legal, very clever, very much designed to screw me over. The cabin came back into view through the trees. Still leaning, still rotting, still the only place I had to sleep. I parked and unloaded my truck. Sleeping bag, duffel of clothes, a toolbox, the groceries such as they were. The sun was going down, and the temperature was dropping fast. October in the Kentucky mountains means 50 degrees during the day and 30 at night. The cabin had no heat, no electricity, no running water. I found a camping lantern in my truck bed and fired it up. The propane hissed and the mantle glowed white. Shadows jumped around the walls like living things. I could see my breath. The fireplace was there, but the chimney was probably home to about 6 generations of birds and squirrels. Burning anything in it would likely fill the cabin with smoke and carbon monoxide. I wasn't that desperate yet. Give it another day or two. I ate a Pop-Tart cold and washed it down with water from a gallon jug I'd filled at the gas station. Lay down in my sleeping bag on the least rotted section of floor. Stare at the ceiling where I could see stars through holes in the roof. This was rock bottom. This was the place where you either climb back up or you stop climbing altogether. I thought about the second option longer than I'm proud to admit. Thought about how easy it would be to just walk into the woods and keep walking. How eventually the cold or the hunger or something with teeth would finish what my family started. Nobody would miss me. Linda had barley. Richard had the distillery. I had a pile of debts and a rotting shack in the mountains. But I didn't walk into the woods. I fell asleep instead, which is its own kind of giving up, I guess. I woke up at dawn with my back screaming and frost on the inside of my sleeping bag. The painkillers had worn off hours ago, and every movement felt like someone was driving an ice pick into my lower spine. I'd slept on bare floor. Stupid. Amateur mistake. I ate another Pop-Tart and some instant coffee I made by heating water in a tin over my camping stove. Tasted like burnt metal and regret. Perfect. The cabin needed work. That was obvious. What wasn't obvious was where to start. The roof leaked. The windows were broken. The floor was soft in places. The walls were stained with mold. This wasn't a renovation project. This was a teardown. But I had $17 and no other options, so I decided to make it livable. At least warm. At least dry enough that I wouldn't wake up with frost on my face. I went out to the truck and grabbed my toolbox. Basic stuff. Hammer, crowbar, screwdrivers, vice grips. The kinds of tools that had fixed things at the distillery when the maintenance guy was out. The floor was the first priority. Some of the boards were so rotted they bent when you stepped on them. Soft like wet cardboard. I figured I could pull up the worst ones, maybe find some scrap wood to replace them with. Make it safe enough to walk on without falling through. I started in the corner by the fireplace where the rot looked worst. Jammed the crowbar under a board and pulled. The wood came up like wet tissue paper. Underneath was black with moisture and termite damage. My back was killing me. Every time I pulled on the crowbar, something in my spine would catch and send lightning up to my shoulders. I was sweating in the cold air, gritting my teeth, taking breaks every few boards to lean against the wall and wait for the pain to pass. This was therapeutic. I told myself, physical labor, working with my hands, better than sitting around feeling sorry for myself. I pulled up another board. This one was longer, ran almost a full length of the room. I wedged the crowbar underneath and threw my whole weight into it. The board cracked. Not a clean break. A wet, splintering crack. And then the floor underneath my left foot just disappeared. I went down fast. 1 second I was standing. The next I was dropping through empty space with my leg punching through rotten wood like it was made of wet paper. My knee hit something hard on the way down. My back twisted. I landed on my side with my leg still dangling through the hole and my head about 6 inches from the fireplace stones. For a few seconds, I just lay there trying to remember how to breathe. My back was on fire. My knee felt like I'd hit it with a hammer. I could smell dust and rot and something else. Something cold and concrete. I pulled myself up onto my elbows and looked down through the hole I'd made. There was space on the floor. Not crawl space. Actual space. I could see concrete in the beam of light coming through the hole. Smooth concrete walls going down at least 6 feet. Professional work. Poured concrete, not just stacked blocks. Someone had built this vault properly, with rebar and forms and planning. This wasn't a storm shelter. This was a warehouse. I grabbed my camping lantern and held it over the hole. The light pushed back the darkness, and I could see it clearly now. A room. A concrete room built under the cabin floor. The termites had eaten through the wooden floorboards, but they'd stopped at the concrete. Couldn't chew through stone. My grandfather had built a vault under his hunting cabin, and I just accidentally discovered it by falling through his floor. I widened the hole with the crowbar, pulled up more boards until I had an opening about 3 feet across. The concrete room below was maybe 8 feet by 10 feet. Dry. No water damage. The air coming up smelled stale, but not moldy. There was a wooden ladder bolted to one wall. Old but solid. I tested it with my weight. It held. I climbed down with the lantern. My back protested every step, but curiosity was stronger than pain. The vault was neat, organized, not like the cabin above. The floor was smooth concrete. The walls were the same, and there were wooden crates everywhere. Stacked floor to ceiling along every wall. Rows of them going back deep into space. Not 40 crates. Not even 100. More like 400. Each one about 2 feet square. Packed tight like my grandfather had been running a distribution operation down here. I set the lantern on one of the crates and pulled the top off another one. Inside was straw packing material. Old straw. The kind that crumbled when you touched it. I pushed the straw aside and saw glass. Bottles. Rows of bottles wrapped in more straw. My heart started beating faster. Bottles in a secret vault under a cabin built in the 20s. This was either very good or very bad. I pulled one out carefully. The glass was thick. Heavy. The bottle was covered in dust. So thick, I couldn't see through it. I wiped it with my sleeve and held it up to the lantern light. Amber liquid. Still liquid. Not empty. The label was mostly gone. Just fragments of paper stuck to the glass. But I could make out words. Medicinal. Purposes. Only. Prohibition-era whiskey. Had to be. My grandfather had hidden whiskey during Prohibition and forgotten about it. Or maybe he'd remembered and never told anyone. Either way, I was holding a bottle that was at least 90 years old. I brushed more dust off the bottle, looking for markings. Anything that would tell me what I was holding. There was a paper strip around the neck. A tax stamp. Faded but readable. My hands were shaking. Not from cold. From something else. I carried the bottle up the ladder. My back screamed at me, but I didn't care. I needed better light. Needed to see this properly. Upstairs, I set the bottle on a windowsill where the morning sun was coming through. Wiped it down with my shirt. The tax strip was printed with tiny text. I had to squint to read it. Distilled fall 1916. Bottled spring 1930. 14 years. This whiskey had been aged for 14 years in oak barrels before being bottled. 14 years during the golden era of American bourbon. Before the Depression. Before modern industrial shortcuts. Before anyone cared about quarterly profits over quality. I knew what 14-year bourbon from 1916 was worth. I'd studied whiskey history. Read every book. Memorized the legendary distilleries and the legendary years. This was museum quality stuff. This was liquid history. My hands were still shaking when I worked the cork out. It was tight, nearly sealed with age. I had to twist and pull for a full minute before it came free with a pop that echoed in the empty cabin. The smell hit me immediately. Sharp. Wrong. Acidic in a way whiskey should never be. Oxidized. Skunked. The seal had failed and air had gotten in and turned the alcohol into something harsh and undrinkable. A century of aging ruined by a bad cork. I poured a tiny amount into my palm. Rubbed it between my fingers. Sniffed it. Yeah, definitely off. The alcohol had evaporated through the failed seal, and what was left was concentrated and wrong. Technically, if enough alcohol evaporates and the proof drops low enough, you can get bacterial action. Acetobacter converting it to something sour. But that takes years and specific conditions. This wasn't that. This was just oxidized. Dead. The volatile compounds that made bourbon worth drinking had escaped through microscopic gaps in the cork decades ago, leaving behind something that smelled more like wood varnish than anything you'd want in a glass. This bottle was ruined. And if this bottle was ruined, probably all of them were ruined. I'd found a vault full of worthless antique bottles filled with oxidized garbage. I threw the bottle at the fireplace. It exploded against the stones with a sound like breaking ice. Glass everywhere. The smell of bad whiskey filling the cabin. 100-year-old artifact destroyed in a fit of anger. I sat down on the floor and put my head in my hands. Of course my grandfather's hidden treasure was worthless. Of course, the one thing I inherited that wasn't explicitly labeled as junk was actually junk anyway. The universe had a sense of humor, and I was the punchline. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing, try not to scream. Then I made myself get up, made myself clean up the glass before I stepped on it, made myself act like an adult instead of a child throwing a tantrum. I was picking up shards when I noticed another bottle, this one sitting on a crate near where I'd been working. I didn't remember putting it there. Must have pulled it out earlier and forgotten. I picked it up, wiped the dust off. This one looked different. The cork was covered in something, dark red stuff that had hardened over the years. Wax. Sealing wax. My heart started beating fast again. Wax was better than just cork. Wax meant an airtight seal. Wax meant maybe the whiskey inside was still good. I carried it to the window, wiped it down carefully. The label was mostly intact on this one. I could read the text clearly. Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, for medicinal purposes only. And underneath that, smaller text, the distillery name, a name I recognized from my studies. One of the legendary pre-Prohibition distilleries that got shut down and never reopened. The tax stamp was there, same as the other bottle. I read it out loud to the empty cabin, like I was trying to convince myself it was real. Distilled fall 1916. Bottled spring 1930. 14 years in the barrel. The golden age. The perfect age for bourbon. Old enough to be complex. Young enough to not be over-oaked. This was the sweet spot. This was what every modern distiller was trying to recreate and failing. I held the bottle up to the light. The liquid inside was dark. Almost mahogany. Rich color that meant deep barrel char and long aging. No sediment. No cloudiness. Just pure amber gold. This wasn't oxidized. This was perfect. I set the bottle down very carefully. Climbed back down into the vault. Started pulling crates open. Counting. 40 crates total. Most of them full. 12 bottles per crate. That was 480 bottles. Minus the ones with failed corks, minus any that were broken. But even if only half were good, that was 240 bottles of 14-year pre-Prohibition bourbon. I knew collectors who would kill for one bottle of this stuff, who would pay 5 figures, maybe more. I was standing in a vault full of lottery tickets, and I hadn't realized it until just now. I climbed back up, sat on the floor next to the wax seal bottle. My back was hurting. My knee was throbbing where I'd hit it, falling to the floor. I was filthy and broke and living in a rotting cabin with no heat or electricity. But I was holding something that might be worth more than everything I'd lost. I didn't know the exact value yet. Didn't know how many bottles were still good. Didn't know if I could even legally sell them, or if there were laws about pre-Prohibition whiskey. But I knew this was something. This was a card I could play. I looked around the cabin. At the holes in the roof and the broken windows and the rotted floors. At my sleeping bag in the corner and my duffel clothes and my $17 in cash. Debris. Junk. Contents. That's what Linda had called this place. That's what she'd written in the divorce settlement. She'd given up her rights to everything in this cabin because she thought it was all worthless. She'd been wrong. I started laughing. Couldn't help it. Started laughing so hard I had to sit down. My back was killing me and my hands were shaking, and I was laughing like a crazy person in a collapsing cabin in the middle of nowhere. Linda had played herself. She'd been so busy being cruel, so focused on humiliating me, that she'd thrown away the one thing that might actually be worth something. The universe didn't have a sense of humor. It had a sense of irony. And right now, that irony was sealed in wax and aged 14 years, and worth more than my ex-wife's entire skincare budget. I spent the rest of the day going through the vault, opening crates, checking bottles, wiping away dust and reading tax stamps. Not all of them were good. Maybe a third had failed corks and oxidized contents. Some crates had water damage from a leak I couldn't identify. Some bottles were broken, but the rest were sealed with wax. Protected, preserved, perfect. I counted carefully. Made notes in the margin of a Pop-Tart box because I didn't have paper. Moved through the vault systematically, checking every crate I could reach. 400 crates times 12 bottles each meant 4,800 bottles total, minus the broken ones, minus the oxidized ones, minus the ones too damaged to sell. I stopped counting at 3,500 bottles with intact wax seals. 3,500 bottles of 14-year pre-prohibition bourbon from one of the legendary distilleries. And there were still crates I hadn't opened yet, stacked too high to reach without a ladder. I didn't know the exact value yet, but I knew it was enough to matter, enough to change things. That night, I didn't sleep in my sleeping bag on the floor. I sat up against the wall, with one of the bottles next to me, just holding it, feeling the weight of it, the history in the glass. My grandfather had hidden this during Prohibition, had bought it legally as medicine before the ban, had sealed it in wax and buried it under his cabin floor and never told anyone. Maybe he planned to sell it someday. Maybe he just wanted to preserve something good in a world that was trying to destroy it. Either way, he'd saved it, and now it was mine. I thought about Linda and Richard, about Bev Corp and the distillery and everything I'd lost, about bank accounts I couldn't access and a dog I'd never see again, and a life that had been dismantled piece by piece. They'd taken everything, every single thing except this cabin and its contents, and they'd done it because they thought those contents were worthless. I was still broke, still trapped in a rotting cabin with $17 and a frozen bank account, still months away from any kind of payout from the distillery sale. But I wasn't helpless anymore. I had something they wanted, something they'd thrown away, something they couldn't take back. I held the bottle up to the lantern light and watched the amber liquid glow like captured fire. This was my lottery ticket, my ace in the hole, my middle finger to everyone who'd written me off. I just had to figure out what to do with it. But first, I needed to know exactly what I had. Needed an expert. Someone who could tell me if I was holding a fortune or just expensive trash. Someone I could trust. That was going to be the hard part. I needed an expert. Someone who knew pre-prohibition whiskey. Someone who could tell me if what I had was worth fighting for or just expensive nostalgia. The problem was trust. I couldn't just walk into any auction house or whiskey shop. News travels fast in the bourbon world. One wrong conversation, and Richard would hear about it. Linda would hear about it. Their lawyers would hear about it. And then I'd be fighting over this collection before I even knew what was worth. So I drove 3 hours south to Lexington with 2 bottles wrapped in towels in a cardboard box. Didn't call ahead. Didn't make an appointment. Just showed up at the shop of a guy I'd known back when I was starting out in the industry. Marcus Webb. Old-timer who'd been appraising rare whiskey since before I was born. Marcus ran his business out of a storefront that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975, with paneling, dusty shelves, a desk buried under catalogs and authentication certificates. He was pushing 70, but still had the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 50 years spotting fakes. He looked up when I walked in. Took him a second to recognize me. Then his face split into a grin, and he said it was good to see me, that he'd heard about the distillery sale, that he was sorry about how things went down. I told him I appreciated it, and asked if he had time to look at something unusual. I set the box on his desk, unwrapped the bottles carefully, watched his expression change from curious to focused to something like hunger. He picked up the first bottle, held it to the light, examined the wax seal, read the tax strip 3 times, set it down and picked up the second bottle, went through the same process. Finally looked at me and asked where I got these. I told him my grandfather's cabin, that I'd found them sealed in a concrete vault, that there were more, a lot more. Marcus was quiet for a long time, just staring at the bottles. Finally he said he needed to do some tests, asked if I could leave them with him for an hour. I said no, I'd wait. He took the bottles to his back room. I heard the clink of glassware, the scratch of paper. An hour turned into 2. I sat in his waiting area reading old whiskey magazines and trying not to think about what would happen if these bottles turned out to be worthless after all. When Marcus came back out, his hands were shaking slightly. He sat down across from me and said he needed to be very careful with what he was about to tell me, that what I had was museum quality. that these weren't just old bottles. These were pre-Prohibition bourbon from one of the legendary Kentucky distilleries that got shut down and never reopened. 14-year age statement. Perfect provenance based on the tax strips. And the condition was flawless because they had been stored in stable temperature and humidity for a century. I asked what they were worth. He pulled out a calculator and a notebook, started talking about recent auction results. A single bottle of similar vintage had sold for $1,800 last year, but that was one bottle. What I had was a collection, and collections at scale change the market. He asked how many bottles I had. I told him 3,500 with intact wax seals. His pen stopped moving. He looked at me like I just told him I had a dinosaur in my truck. 3,500 bottles times $1,800 average auction price. That was $6.3 million. Give or take. Marcus said the number would fluctuate depending on the auction house, the buyer pool, and how fast I wanted to liquidate. But $6 million was conservative. If I was patient and strategic, I could push it higher, much higher. I sat there trying to process that number. $6 million. Hidden under a cabin floor. Dismissed as debris and junk by my ex-wife. Signed away in a divorce settlement because nobody thought it was worth claiming. Marcus asked if I wanted him to connect me with auction houses. Said he knew people at Sotheby's and Christie's who specialize in rare spirits. I told him yes, but I needed discretion. Nobody could know about this until I was ready to go public. He understood, said he'd make some calls, vet the auction houses, set up meetings under NDAs. This was going to take time to do right. Weeks, maybe months. But if I played it smart, I'd walk away with enough money to never worry again. I drove back to the cabin with my mind racing. $6 million. That was real money. Life-changing money. Revenge money. But first I had to make sure nobody could take it from me. I spent the next week going through every inch of that cabin, looking for documents, proof of ownership, anything that would establish this collection as mine legally and permanently. The cabin was full of my grandfather's things. Old hunting gear, furniture that had rotted into lumps, boxes of papers that mice had nested in. I went through it all methodically. Every drawer, every closet, every corner. I found his journal in a metal lockbox under a pile of moth-eaten blankets. The lock was rusted, but I got it open with a screwdriver and some WD-40. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was still readable. My grandfather had beautiful handwriting, the old-fashioned kind they don't teach anymore. He'd documented everything. The purchase of the whiskey in 1930, how he'd bought it legally as medicinal spirits during the tail end of Prohibition, how he'd paid in gold because he didn't trust banks after the crash of '29, how he'd sealed it in wax and buried it under the cabin because he was afraid the government would confiscate it. There were pages of entries about his distrust of federal authorities, about how he'd seen too many good businesses destroyed by bureaucrats who didn't understand the industry, about how he was saving this collection for future, for his children, for his grandchildren, for whenever the country came to its senses. At the back of the journal, folded carefully, was the original bill of sale, dated April 15, 1930, purchased by my grandfather as a private individual. Not through the distillery, not as a business asset, as personal property bought with personal funds. This was the proof I needed. This was the paper trail that would kill any claim from Richard or Bev Corp. Or anyone else who tried to say this collection belonged to the family business. But I found something else too, something that made the whole thing even better. In one of the crates in the vault, packed carefully between bottles, were stacks of unused prescription pads. The kind doctors used during Prohibition to prescribe medicinal alcohol. Each pad had a watermark from the 1920s. Each page was blank, waiting for a doctor's signature that never came. These pads alone were historical artifacts, collectible items worth hundreds of dollars each. But more importantly, they proved that my grandfather had intended to sell this whiskey legally, that he'd set up a distribution system, that this wasn't just personal consumption. This was a business operation that never got off the ground because Prohibition ended before he could launch it. I photographed everything. The journal, the bill of sale, the prescription pads. Uploaded the photos to a cloud storage account using a VPN. Made backups of the backups. This was too important to risk losing. Then I contacted the auction houses Marcus had recommended, set up meetings, signed NDAs, showed them samples and documentation. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every auction house wanted the collection. They were talking about specialty sales, international buyers, museum acquisitions. This wasn't just a whiskey auction. This was a historical event. We scheduled the auction for 6 weeks out. That gave them time to catalog the collection, photograph each bottle, build hype in the collector community. I hired an attorney, a real one this time, someone who specialized in estate law and high-value asset protection. Cost me $2,000 just for consultation, but it was worth it. My attorney reviewed everything: the bill of sale, the divorce settlement, the inheritance chain from my grandfather to my father to me. He said I had an airtight case. The whiskey was mine, period. But he warned me that Linda and Richard would try to challenge it anyway, that they'd claim it was marital property or business property or hidden assets, that I needed to be ready for a legal fight. I told him I was ready, more than ready. The news leaked 2 weeks before the auction. I don't know how. Maybe someone at the auction house talked. Maybe Marcus mentioned it to the wrong person. Maybe the universe just decided it was time. My phone started ringing. Unknown numbers. I didn't answer. Then came the texts. Then the voicemails. Then Richard called from a number I recognized. I let it go to voicemail. Listened to the message later. He was trying to sound friendly, calling me Tommy like we were kids again, saying we needed to talk, that we were family, that surely we could work something out. I called him back using one of the burner phones I bought specifically for this. Didn't want him having my real number. Didn't want him tracking me. He answered on the first ring. Started with a family speech. How we both made mistakes. How we could move past this. How the whiskey collection was obviously a company asset, and we should split it fairly. I let him talk. Let him dig his hole deeper. Then I told him the collection wasn't a company asset, that my grandfather had bought it as a private citizen with his own money, that I had the documentation to prove it, that the auction was happening whether he liked it or not. His tone changed, got hard, threatening. He said I was stealing from the family, that BevCorp's lawyers would sue me into the ground, that I'd end up in prison for fraud, that I'd lose everything all over again. I told him good luck with that and hung up. 2 days later, BevCorp filed an injunction trying to block the auction, claimed the whiskey collection was part of the distillery assets they'd purchased, that I'd hidden it during the sale, that I was attempting to defraud them. My attorney filed a response within hours, included copies of my grandfather's bill of sale, included the journal entries, included the chain of inheritance documentation, included the divorce settlement that specifically gave me all contents of the cabin. The hearing was scheduled for a week before the auction. Federal court. Judge who looked like she'd been on the bench since the Carter administration and had exactly zero patience for nonsense. BevCorp's legal team showed up with 3 attorneys and a paralegal, all of them in matching suits carrying matching briefcases. They had PowerPoint presentations and exhibits, and a whole case built around the idea that any whiskey found on property connected to the distillery family was automatically distillery property. My attorney stood up a manila folder and a 4-page brief. He walked the judge through the documentation, showed her the 1930 bill of sale with my grandfather's signature, explained that this was a private purchase made with personal funds before the distillery was even incorporated, explained that the whiskey had been stored in a private hunting cabin that had never been business property, explained that even if there was any ambiguity, the divorce settlement had explicitly transferred all contents of said cabin to me. BevCorp's lead attorney tried to argue that the language in the divorce settlement was vague, that contents could be interpreted differently, that nobody had known about the whiskey collection at the time. The judge asked to see the divorce settlement, read it quietly for about 30 seconds, then asked BevCorp's attorney what part of all contents and debris he found ambiguous. He tried to argue that high-value items should have been disclosed separately, that this was clearly a hidden asset. The judge pointed out that my ex-wife had drafted the settlement language herself, that she'd specifically used the words debris and junk to describe the cabin contents, that if she wanted to exclude valuable items, she should have said so. Then she asked if anyone had actually inventoried the cabin contents before the divorce was finalized. BevCorp's attorney admitted they had not. The judge looked at me, asked if I had known about the whiskey collection before the divorce. I told her the truth, that I had discovered it by accident weeks after the settlement was signed, that I'd fallen through a rotted floor and found a concrete vault nobody knew existed. She asked if I had deliberately hidden the collection. I said no, that I'd had no idea it was there. She looked back at BevCorp's legal team, asked them if they had any evidence of fraud or deliberate concealment. They said they were confident such evidence would emerge during discovery. The judge said discovery was for plaintiffs who had a case, which they did not. She denied the injunction, said the whiskey collection was clearly my personal property per the bill of sale and the divorce settlement. Case closed. BevCorp's attorneys looked like someone had kicked them. My attorney packed up his single folder and shook my hand. The whole hearing took 45 minutes. But we weren't done, because Linda had filed her own motion, claiming the whiskey collection was marital property, that it should have been divided in the divorce, that I had deliberately hidden it to avoid splitting assets. That hearing was scheduled for 3 days before the auction. Different court, different judge. Same outcome I was hoping for. Linda showed up with her shark attorney, the one from Louisville who charged $500 an hour and smiled like a barracuda. He had prepared statements, character witnesses ready to testify that I was financially manipulative, a whole narrative about how I'd secret away valuable assets while crying poverty. My attorney let him talk, let him build his case, let him put on his whole show. Then he put the divorce settlement up on a screen, projected it so everyone in the courtroom could read it, highlighted the section Linda herself had written about the cabin contents. He read it out loud. Husband shall receive the deteriorated cabin structure and all debris, junk, and contents located therein and on the surrounding property. Then he explained to the judge what had happened, that Linda had demanded I take the cabin specifically because she believed it was worthless, that she'd insist on a language calling everything inside debris and junk, that she'd done this deliberately to humiliate me, and that now she wanted to go back and claim the valuable items she'd explicitly rejected. The judge asked Linda's attorney if he was familiar with the legal concept of estoppel. He said he was. The judge explained for everyone else in the courtroom. Estoppel means you can't contradict yourself in court to gain an advantage. If you explicitly classify something as worthless trash in a legal document, you can't later claim it's valuable community property when you find out you were wrong. She asked Linda directly if she had written the language in the settlement, if she had called the cabin contents debris and junk, if she had voluntarily given up her rights to everything in that cabin. Linda tried to explain that she hadn't known about the whiskey, that it was a hidden asset, that I should have disclosed it. The judge cut her off, asked again, yes or no, did you write that language? Did you classify the contents as debris? Did you give up your rights? Linda had to say yes, because saying no would mean she'd committed perjury in the original divorce filing, would mean she'd hidden assets herself. The judge denied the motion, said Linda had made her bed and now she had to lie in it, said she hoped this was a lesson about trying to humiliate people in divorce settlements because sometimes it backfired spectacularly. Walking out of that courthouse was one of the best moments of my life. Linda was standing in the hallway with her attorney. He was explaining something to her in a voice that sounded expensive and useless. She looked at me, opened her mouth like she was going to say something. I walked past her like she was furniture. The auction happened 3 days later. Online and in-person bidding. Collectors from 15 countries. Museums. Private buyers. Whiskey nerds with too much money and a passion for history. The bidding started at $50,000 per lot. Each lot was 50 bottles. It climbed fast. 70,000, 90,000, 120,000 per lot. I watched from Marcus's office. Couldn't bring myself to be in the actual auction house. Too nervous. Two worried something would go wrong at the last second. But nothing went wrong. The numbers kept climbing. The lots kept selling. 2 hours later, it was over. Final total, $6.4 million. Minus auction house fees and taxes, I'd clear about $4.8 million. I sat in Marcus's office, staring at the final number on the screen, $4.8 million. From a collection I'd found by falling through a rotten floor. From debris my ex-wife had thrown away. From the one thing I'd inherited that everyone else thought was worthless. Marcus shook my hand, said I'd just made history, that this was the largest single-owner collection of pre-prohibition whiskey ever sold, that people would be talking about this for decades. I drove back to the cabin in a daze, kept checking my phone to make sure it was real, that the numbers weren't going to disappear like a dream. The money hit my account 3 days later. I spent the first $1,000 buying barley back from Linda. She tried to negotiate, tried to say the dog was worth more now that I had money. I offered her double the cost of a golden retriever puppy. She took it. Barley remembered me, went crazy when he saw me, jumped and whined and licked my face like I'd come back from the dead. I sat on the ground in Linda's driveway and let him climb all over me while Linda watched from her doorway with her arms crossed. I spent the next 6 months renovating the cabin, hired contractors, fixed the roof, replaced the floors except for the area over the vault, which I reinforced and sealed properly, put in real windows, real insulation, a heating system that didn't involve burning questionable wood in a fireplace. The cabin became beautiful, not fancy, not showy, just solid, the way my grandfather had probably imagined it when he built it. I was sitting on the porch one evening when a car pulled up the driveway. BMW. I recognized it before the driver got out. Richard. He walked up to the porch like he was visiting an old friend, smiled, commented on the renovations, said the place looked good, asked if we could talk. I didn't invite him inside, just waited. He launched into an apology, said he'd made mistakes, that he'd been under pressure from investors, that selling the distillery had been the hardest decision of his life, that he'd been trying to save the company and made some bad choices, that he hoped we could move forward as brothers. I let him finish. Then I went inside and came back with 2 glasses and a bottle, one of the pre-prohibition bottles I'd kept for myself. 14-year bourbon from 1916, unopened, perfect. I opened it carefully. The cork came out clean. The smell hit me immediately. Vanilla and oaken thyme, complex and deep and absolutely perfect. I poured 2 glasses, handed one to Richard. He took it, looked at the amber liquid, started to raise it to his lips. I told him not to drink it yet, told him to smell it first, to really smell it. He did. His eyes widened. He said it smelled incredible. I told him about the whiskey, about how the grain was grown before pesticides, before industrial farming, how the barrels were made from trees that were 200 years old when they were cut, how the distillery that made this had cared about quality more than profit, how my grandfather had hidden his collection because he knew people like Richard would come along eventually, people who saw price tags instead of value, people who would sell their grandfather's legacy for a quick exit and a nice suit. I told him he'd never be able to recreate this, that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the time and craftsmanship that went into this bottle, that Bev Corp had bought a distillery and lost the soul of it, that without the master distiller who actually knew how to make good bourbon, they were just bottling mediocre alcohol with a heritage label. Then I poured both glasses onto the dirt, watched 14-year-old bourbon soak into the ground, a toast to people who weren't there, to my grandfather who'd hidden treasure, to my father who'd kept a secret without knowing it, to everyone who'd ever made something beautiful and protected it from people who destroy it for money. I told Richard to leave, to get off my property, to never come back. He stood there for a second, looking at the wet dirt where $1,000 of whiskey had just disappeared. Then he walked back to his BMW and drove away. I sat back down on the porch. Barley put his head on my knee. We watched the sun set over the mountains. I heard later that Bev Corp sued Richard, claimed he'd sold him a distillery while hiding the existence of the whiskey collection. that he'd defrauded them, that he'd breached his fiduciary duty. The case was still ongoing last I checked. I also heard that Bevcorp's bourbon quality had tanked, that without someone who actually knew what they were doing, they'd started producing inconsistent batches, that sales were down, that the brand I'd spent 15 years building was dying under their management. There's a term for that in business: competence porn. When you prove that expertise matters more than money, that some things can be bought or faked, that real skill shows up in the final product. I didn't start a new distillery. Didn't need to prove anything. Instead, I invested the money carefully, set myself up for life, bought back some of the equipment Bevcorp had sold off just to keep it, to preserve it. Sometimes I sit on my porch with barley and think about my grandfather, about how he'd lived through Prohibition and the Depression and multiple wars, how he'd hidden his collection not because he was greedy, but because he understood that good things needed protecting, that not everyone would see the value in 14 years of patient aging, that some people would always choose quick money over lasting quality. Linda tried to reach out once, sent a letter saying she'd made mistakes, that she'd been going through something and had handled the divorce poorly, that she hoped we could be friends. I never responded. Some bridges you burn for good reason. Richard tried to come back once more. I didn't let him pass the gate. Some people you forgive. Some people you just forget. The cabin is mine. The land is mine. The peace is mine. I don't have millions in the bank anymore. Most of it's invested, tied up in boring stuff that grows slowly and steadily. But I have enough. More than enough. And every now and then, when I'm feeling philosophical, I open one of the bottles I kept, pour a small glass, smell the history, taste what my grandfather preserved. It tastes like patience, like knowing that good things take time, like understanding that not everything valuable has a price tag. It tastes like winning.